I write about science for the Globe and Mail. That's my primary occupation these days. I had previous roles as a news editor for Nature, a bureau chief for New Scientist. I also was a producer and columnist for Discovery Channel, and have done a number of other writing and broadcasting jobs over the years. So I've, in some form or another, I think I've hit all the various media platforms, all in science. I noticed that the way this opening session is framed is what the media expects from you. And I was thinking about that last night. I thought, boy, that sounds really demanding. I feel like maybe that immediately put you off. Because, of course, if you're a productive researcher, if you're really doing your job and advancing the scientific endeavor and making the best use of your grant money, you're probably very busy. So the idea that someone else wants something from you, the media, is you know, I can imagine that's can be a bit annoying. So let me start with what you might want from the media or from journalists specifically, and in particular, why you should even consider speaking to a journalist if a journalist emails or calls you. What's in it for you as a scientist? And I think that's an excellent question that we should address right off the top. We're living in a time now where I'm sure as scientists you're probably, it's probably hammered into you, the importance of getting your message out, the importance of interacting with the press and with the public at large. But being scientists, you might regard that with some skepticism too, especially if you're busy. And you might ask yourself, do I really need anything from the media right now? Maybe you do if you're at a particular moment in your research where some public attention would help. And the one thing that journalists represent or may offer in some form is attention, the attention of their audience. So in that sense, the attention is kind of the commodity that a journalist could bring to you. But you probably don't need public attention all the time. Probably you don't need it most of the time. So that may not be enough of an incentive. And on top of that, there are lots of ways of getting attention without the traditional media platforms. I mean, there's social media now. There's all kinds of ways of reaching out that don't involve journalists or the media at all. And you might think, well, you know, if I need to get attention, I'll tweet it. I'll do this or that. It worked for Donald Trump. Why not for you guys? And on top of that, on top of all of that, when you're engaging with a journalist, you also have to realize that whatever the journalist is there for, they are not there to promote your science. That's absolutely not the journalist's job. Not there to promote science, not there to promote biomedical research. Broadly speaking, the reason the journalist is there, the reason the journalist might be calling you at any moment, you know, journalists are there basically to inform citizens, to tell them what they need to know so that they can be, so that we can have a self-governing society, basically. And I'm pulling that directly from Kovacs and Rosenstiel. There's kind of a classic book, The Elements of Journalism, where they talk about the primary function of journalism in society. It's not to promote science. It may come out that journalists cover science, and it may be that the public need to be informed about science and the implications of science, but it's not a PR function. So with all of that in mind, you come back to this, well, then why should I even bother talking to a reporter? And the honest answer is individually, there may be no benefit to you whatsoever in speaking to a reporter when a reporter calls. But collectively, there's an extremely important benefit. And you know, just to step back all the way, and you know, there are former journalists in the room here, so I'm going to try not to be overly dramatic about this, but historically speaking, you know, societies that have a robust and free press are societies that have been the most supportive of scientific inquiry and funding and support for research. Maybe we'll come to a point in history where that correlation is no longer the case, but since the Enlightenment, roughly speaking, kind of open inquiry, freedom of the press, freedom of information in society has tended to go hand in hand with scientific inquiry. There are allied activities, actually. And so I often, when scientists sort of present this case, like, why do I really, especially, if you're a little bit worried about the media, if you're worried about how things might get reported, is it better to just kind of stay away? And I just try to impress on people in research that, there is a kind of a joint benefit to the kind of society we live in, where there is access and open questioning of things, both scientific and social. So let's talk about this, because I don't want to talk at you. When you think, I don't know how many, some of you have been journalists, some of you have probably no doubt spoken to journalists, some of you maybe only have read the news from time to time. So when we talk about journalists, I'm going to grab a whiteboard here. Take the blue one. I just want to get a sense from you what qualities you think might define a journalist's frame of mind, a journalist's approach to the world, just the way the journalist works. What's your impression of what qualities would describe them? Objectivity. I'm sure there'd be lots of arguments about that. What else? What qualities stand out in your mind when you think of like the archetypal journalist in your head?
Look for evidence. Don't just trust that someone says something that's true.
Okay, so
Quote, journalists, when their mother says they love them, will say, well, how can you prove that?
yeah, exactly. So evidence-based, or like verification, I guess. It's sometimes been said that basically journalism is the practice of verification. What else? Like in just terms of how they work.
I was going to say balanced.
Balanced. Okay, so that sort of maybe goes along with objectivity. I think these things would absolutely apply to scientists, for example.
Inquisitive, so always asking questions.
Right? Curious. I think that's. I said curious, inquisitive. They're both. Yeah. Transparent. Yeah. Another important thing. These are all again very much like science. You could easily say these are science. I mean, in theory, you should be able to redo an experiment that someone else has published. That should be transparent what was done. Also, in theory, you should be able to re-report a story that a journalist has reported and get the same result.
Wanting to tell a good story and engage the reader.
Right. So engagement, storytelling. How about the way journalists work? Are there some ways that they might be different from scientists? Go ahead, you had an answer. Yeah. Yeah, time critical. In a way that is sometimes hard for almost anyone else to understand. I think that's a good set of answers. I'm going to go back to that in a minute. What do you think scientists are most worried about in their encounters with journalists? Let's put an S for scientists, and I'm gonna say fears here. What do you think research? I mean, it may not apply to you, but in general, what do you think researchers worry about?
Misrepresentation.
Right. Misrepresentation. Sorry, my handwriting is terrible. I would never be able to work if we were in the age of handwriting.
Not presenting a true balance of the picture, so I'm thinking like of the climate change, where
Right.
3%, 97% of the evidence shows climate change, but
Right.
the media will put that 3% as being more weighted. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. I was going to write consensus, but weighted. Kind of. But I know what you're getting at. That's sort of things as kind of the state of things as they are in terms of what state of opinion. Anything else? Go ahead. Yeah, hype, sensationalism. Journalists sensationalize. Oops, sorry. Okay. You roughly know. I'm going to misspell everything. You probably. One more.
Simplifying the information so much that it doesn't seem accurate anymore to the
Right. Oversimplified until it's wrong. These are all good fears.
That
One more.
the journalist has an agenda, so they come to do an interview and work on rats, and
Yeah.
the story ends up being on how many rats you killed rather than how many rats you got.
But it's so interesting how many rats you kill. Yes. Sorry. Agenda. Okay, one more. I know there is some good suggestions. Someone had a right back.
I guess it's more the slant of the news agency that they represent.
Huh. Interesting. Right.
Political implications from that.
Good. I wanted to get those ideas out on the table because I think that sort of underlies a lot of this conversation. I'm not even quite sure where we'll go with all of these, but these are all, I think you've named the main ones that come up again and again in this kind of conversation, valid or not. Let me, and I think in some cases very valid, I'll say a few things from my perspective. I think these are all kind of true, and I think many of these are shared with research. I'll add another one to this, which is humility, in the sense that, if you're a researcher, you're constantly asking yourself, how much can I draw from this data? At some point, people may say, okay, the data is good, but your interpretation, I don't buy that. So there's a sense of how far can the data actually take you? And there's a very similar kind of sense in journalism where the facts can only take you so far, and all you can do is try to get more facts if you're trying to find out more. And of course, if you go too far, if you go too far in science, you sort of lose credibility. If you go too far in journalism, you end up in court by trying to take facts, by trying to assume things beyond what the facts will tell you. But there are some other things that are sort of more along the lines of just the way things work, where the differences become more pronounced. So journalism is very time critical. It also is reactive in a sense that it depends very much on external factors and events. There's only so much that I can control in my work because I'm responding to the world and trying to capture the events of the world, and I don't know what the news is going to be tomorrow. So planning can be very difficult. It's also bimodal. That's something that's not obvious unless you're working in it, because most people sort of see the product of journalism and it actually, that product is produced through two very different activities. There's a gathering phase and there's a constructive phase. The gathering phase is what we usually call reporting. The constructive phase is usually what we call writing. But when you're contacted by a journalist, what they need from you varies very much depending on what phase of that they're in. And sometimes it's a blend of the two, but that actually defines often what they want. The other thing that, obviously it's also relentless. It never stops. On and on and on. So it's got to be forward-looking. And the other, just one last thing I would add, which is again not obvious unless you're in the profession, because you talk about reporting, you talk about writing, I have a wonderful slide sometimes that I show if I'm doing a PowerPoint where you see a scene from My Gal Friday. So it's like Cary Grant and is it Rosalind Russell? Anyway, it's on the old-fashioned telephone, and you see the typewriters, and you basically see the tools of reporting in a newsroom from the 1940s. And you look at our newsroom in the Globe and Mail today, it looks, not a lot has changed in the sense that the two main tools on any reporter's desk are the phone and the typewriter, or the computer. So, but that's actually not the defining act. Neither asking questions nor writing sentences is the defining act of journalism. The defining act, I would argue, is judgment. It's actually the choice about what to ask about, what to investigate, what to write about. So there's this constant process of judgment because we're flooded with information the world is as busy as ever with people doing things, where events surround us. And so there's this constant judging process that has like what's worth reporting, what's worth writing about. And that tends to be the key process that's hidden, but that is always at work when you're talking to a journalist. So the other thing I should say about the media, I think it's important to remember whenever you're dealing with the media, I realize I'm about to hit the barrier here, is they're not uniform. Sometimes we talk about the media like it's a monolithic thing. It's incredibly diverse. Diverse platforms, diverse styles, diverse audiences, diverse ownership. People talk about slants and agendas. There's actually, if you're working for a mainstream organization, you're not actually affected typically by the slant of the organization. But anyway, there's tremendous diversity, and also it is uncredentialed in the sense that by design, you don't. I mean, every now and then people wonder, and I'm going to just wrap up. People wonder, like, wouldn't it be better if like there had to be like a special certificate that reporters would get, and you wouldn't be allowed to report unless you had that special certificate. So there are none of those controls because, of course, that would then create a gate against freedom of expression. So by design, uncredentialed, non-sanctioned membership, so people build up their audiences and their credibility with a track record, and that's how journalism works. So, and that track record consists of, veracity, originality, transparency, timeliness, relevance, all of the things that we've talked about. So let me say one more thing to address Neil's point, and then I'll stop, and I'll sort of pick up a bit more when we get into the exercise. And I'm just going to say something about audiences. So some people in this room have heard me say this before, but I've worked for a number of organizations. And over the course of doing that, I've come to realize that there's sort of three main audiences, and it's a spectrum. But, for example, when I worked at Nature, we typically were addressing an audience that I would call the professionally interested audience. So this is the PI audience. And it may be PIs that are in that audience, but it's also people who are professionally involved in science and need to keep track of science or research, biomedical research, for their own work. Maybe they're even investors or other people who follow science, but it's a professionally driven reason to keep track of. So there is an audience like that that's professionally interested. Then there's something called a casually interested audience. Again, these are my terms. So, first of all, that's like the Nature, Science, Cell Press, and I don't mean the peer-reviewed papers. I mean the editorial content that goes around those papers, like the front half of Nature, the news, the features, the opinion. That's all written for that professionally interested audience. Casually interested is this is Scientific American. This is, National Geographic, New Scientist. What I mean by this audience is that this is an audience that's seeking science. I want to find out about science. So they might be subscribing to magazines, they may be going on websites, they might be watching particular kinds of TV shows that they know are about science. So it's kind of an intellectual entertainment, or for some other reason they just want to know about science. And then finally, there is this casually disinterested audience, which is the largest possible audience, which is sort of what Lisa was talking about, and that's the audience I work with at the Globe and Mail. By that, I don't mean that they're necessarily actively disinterested in science. What I mean is that they are looking for news, not for science. Science may be part of the news, but before they turned the page or clicked on the story or clicked the channel or switched on the radio, the second before they did that, they were not looking for science. That is a much larger audience. That's the mass media audience. It's worth keeping track of this because it creates a very interesting warped effect in Canada. Canada's got a fairly robust research community for a country of its size, but it's small in the overall global scheme of research. As an English-speaking country, Canada has lots of mainstream media, like the Globe and Mail and so on, CBC News. But these other forms of media, Nature, Science, Scientific American, National Geographic, what you notice about them is they're not published in Canada. So this section, which is maybe offers more in-depth looks at science, tends to come to us from outside of our own country. And the people who write for these, they may be in Canada, but they're not necessarily going to be writing from a Canadian perspective, because that's not what editors want. Some of you in this room, I think, have heard me say this before, but the upshot is that, I mean, there are actually quite a number of science writers in Canada. It's a good country to be in if you write about science. If you are a science writer in Canada, odds are that your work does not appear in a Canadian publication. And if you are someone who's interested in science and seeking information about science in Canada, odds are you're not getting it from a Canadian publication. Therefore, our science nationally tends to be underreported, even in the proportional to the rest of the world. So it's kind of an interesting effect. But to speak to Neil's point, and this will be my final point, what's the difference in writing to these audiences? You know, do you have to dumb it down for the broader circle, for example? Is the language different? The answer, in my experience, is very, very little difference, almost no difference, in one sense. Because all of these audiences are the same in one way. These are all a non-specialist audience. And you might wonder, well, wait a minute. If you're writing for PIs, if you're writing for Nature or Science, how can they be non-specialists? If I'm writing a story about cosmology, the microbiologist reading that story in Nature is as non-specialized as the stockbroker reading about it in the Wall Street Journal. They are equally distant, or almost equally distant from that cosmology story, or for that quantum computing story. Even Nature and Science are still kind of casting a broad net. They're still writing for an adult non-specialist audience. And all of these publications have websites, and there are certain stories that come up, like a cosmology story, and I could swap the brand of the story, and you wouldn't recognize, okay, is this the Nature story? Is this the New York Times story? They're very, very similar, because it's all trying to reach that same level of accessibility. So in a way, you almost don't have to worry about it, because the broad media audience is this audience. The difference, to the extent that there is a difference, is the choice of story. The Nature audience is interested in a different type of story, typically, maybe more funding and policy stories. You know, the Globe and Mail audience might be more interested in stories that have a social effect. The middle audience here might be more interested in stories that kind of stimulate their curiosity. So the choices of what to cover might be different, but the actual style is remarkably similar. Okay, I'll stop there so we can get to that first workshop, and then I'll pick up some more ideas later.